talking all about vintage gear today. And so when I say vintage gear, we all have stuff that is near and dear to our hearts that has nostalgia. But there is some old stuff that actually still has value and actually still has some use and utility. And a lot of times when we talk about the affliction that most of us get on this show, we call it, we have gas, and that doesn't mean that we had Brussels sprouts yesterday. It means gear acquisition syndrome. So we end up with a lot of stuff. And we don't always just want to throw it into a dumpster. We're always trying to figure out, how do I make sure that this thing still has a useful life? And that could be that I'm handing it down to somebody. Or in this case, we're trying to find creative ways to still use the gear. So we've got a great panel in who's got a lot of show and tell stuff too. And I was hoping that we could get Alex to come in because I know he still has a couple of things. He's brought up his Pix 240 once or twice. I know I saw a question about that in there. That they're still useful in the pipeline. And so there's sometimes we're doing workarounds to make those things happen. Sometimes we're really getting the best product that we want. We're getting the sound that we want. We're getting a certain look that's difficult to recreate without that piece of gear. So it still has a place, not only in our hearts, but in the productions. But I don't want to spend too much time gabbing on about it. We've got like I said, a pretty large panel who's got way more experience than I. So, Guy, why don't you start us down the path for what vintage gear do you still have working a sweat?
I don't know if it's that vintage because it's not as vintage as like my Commodore 64 floppy drive from 1985, and this is my original one. So I don't use that anymore, but I grabbed it just because. But yeah, I'm just going to go with my MixPre D. I had to pull this one out of production just to be able to show it to you. So I still use it all the time. The unique thing about this one is it is a digital interface. So it does hook in via just regular USB, but it is two XLR ins. You got this beautiful LED VU meter that's very fast. They call it ballistic. And it's got real XLR outputs, and these can be mic or line level and AES. So this is a pretty sweet device. And I have the optional camera mount adapter on it. So you can mount this under a camera. And then it does have a Hirose 4-pin power input as well, in addition to, and this is just military grade. I mean, you feel this thing, it is really just a tank. And you can put AA batteries inside of here, and it's kind of a watertight compartment there. But yeah, this is probably the thing that I would say is it's not hugely vintage. I mean, I've just had it a long time, so I love this thing. And it's just 2 channels. You could just turn it up and turn it down, and 48-volt phantom power. So pretty slick little device.
It is a testament to the buy once, cry once mentality when you have something that you pick up that you're starting to use and it still works when it's 10, 15, 20 years later. I remember, and this isn't necessarily production. I guess it's not production gear, but one example that I love is that I've got this old iPod Hi-Fi back here, right? Thing still works, still powers on. Unfortunately, somebody broke off an 1/8-inch jack in the back of it. So the only thing that I can do is use it with this old iPod from 2005, because this Airport Express won't work on it anymore. But sometimes you can find creative ways to get older gear in there. For example, this is a little Bluetooth adapter from some no-name company on Amazon, but has a 30-pin on the bottom. So I was able to turn this into a Bluetooth speaker and not have to deal with whatever songs that I put onto this iPod 20 years ago. So not quite production, but it does make you smile when things are still working just as they were. And also makes you smile when things are just pretty. Like, I love the way this grill looks. But Bill, go ahead.
Well, speaking of things that are pretty, I'm gonna do kind of 2 versions of this. Number one, in terms of active use, I would say my classic Neumann TLM 103, which I've had for probably 25 or 30 years. I'm still using it virtually every day when I do voice work. And so that's stood the test of time. But if you want to dive back a little bit, and why not dive back a little bit, that shelf behind me that you guys often see, this is a close-up of what's actually there. And so the oldest piece that still turns on, and I just turned it on, it's still functioning, is this wire recorder from the late 1920s, early 1930s. And yes, it actually records, I don't know if you can see on the bottom left corner, on little spools of wire about the size of a human hair. You have to thread it just like you would an old tape recorder. That Art Deco style mic still functions. I have never seen the connector that it uses on any other thing. And this is kind of my wall of things that I used for a long time. The old Royal typewriter, there's 8mm projectors, and my original Mac 128 that I bought as a kid and is still going strong. I haven't actually booted the Mac in a long time. But there is something to be said for looking back at where things came from. And I have made some money over the course of the years by having some of these things. I remember getting a call maybe 8 or 10 years ago because I had put out on the internet that I owned a wire recorder. And somebody says, oh my gosh, it's amazing that you still have a machine that works. Could you do this? This is my grandfather playing the harp or something like that. And I said, sure, send it on. And I was able to translate that and send it back. And it was just a nice moment. So sometimes holding on to this old stuff is a good stuff. Oh, somebody's noting that I'm getting some background noise. It's probably because I turned that on and it's actually running in the background. So that thump, thump, thump you hear is actually the motors from 1929 still functioning today.
Yeah, there is something to be said for older computers, too, because sometimes you will pull out a file that you can't open on a newer machine. Like we have an older database with some archive files on it that runs on FileMaker 6, right? Copyright 2002. I have to keep a 2008 iMac still in commission because that's the last thing that I have that can run Snow Leopard, which means it's the last thing that can run a PowerPC app. And someday you want to convert it because you don't want to be relying on that system or scrounging around on eBay. But if you've got older files or older projects that haven't been converted yet, then hey, you need that older piece of gear just in order to open it up. Obviously, if it's important, we'll consider converting it sometime. Go ahead, Courtney.
Well, Bill, if you had exchanged that old 415 or 416 of yours for an 816. I don't think I can get this in the shop. I have to put it behind my head. It'd have a lot more directivity, and it wouldn't pick up as much of the background noise as that. That still works. And my fascination with small computers goes way back, and it started with calculators. And remember when calculators came in a belt pack that had a belt clip on it? You'd carry it on your belt like a true nerd. This is a fairly rare. This is where it started. This is a Commodore calculator. Before they made computers, calculator, LED display. Also have an old TI scientific calculator, which had an LED display. But here's was my first. You know how I'm fascinated with tiny computers, as I've shown many of them here in the Melee. I went back and found something on the shelf yesterday. Here's the carrying case for it. Little ASMR. This is my first small computer. If I can get it out. Oh, it's trapped. This was and it has the printer with it as well. This was
there you go.
That was the pocket computer from Radio Shack, and it had its own, I guess that is a thermal printer, maybe it's a contact printer, but it was removable. And it had, you could program it in BASIC, print out your programs. And that was my first mini computer that I had. And of course, now, as far as sound equipment goes, I have, if I can pick it up, the 35 pounds.
Nagra?
So this is Nagra 4.2.
Oh, yeah.
It is like a Swiss watch. Still works, I believe. I've taken the batteries out of it because it takes 12 D cells and has some tape on it. And it's hard to find. I used to carry this over my shoulder every day. Oh,
one of those things
where. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Used to carry it over my shoulder every day. And that is the actual recorder that was used to record the soundtrack from the movie Roar, which looked like this on the set. So it was a little bit dangerous to shoot. And I've just unplugged my headset. So let me plug it back in.
So here you go. Now we know when we are for the documentary about the production of Roar that Office Hours is going to produce, we need to make sure that we go to Courtney so that we can get the period appropriate gear and that we're not making any mistakes. And then for our hero character, Courtney, he'll have that computer with the thermal printer in the room as he's up at night logging the footage. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, I wanted to ask Guy. I do have an old Microsoft disk here from a while back, and perhaps you could give me a read on this, or maybe not. That is an 8-inch. That is an 8-inch floppy disk. Of course, we do have the smaller 5 1/4 discs, but anyhow, probably not. Oh well. Let's go over here and say that if you're going to do any sort of audio editing, this is what you wanted to use back in the day. Back in the 60s, when I was working at an FM station and you wanted to edit tape, you actually put it in the aluminum block and used a razor blade. So none of this computerized equipment and so forth was available. Also from that same FM station, I've got a final tube from the 10,000 watt transmitter that then went into the 10 times antenna system. So we were 100,000 watts. This thing is massive. It's like 8 pounds. The top of it is silver, all the fins, because that's what was best for cooling back then. Yeah, it's been banged up a little bit, but we would also, I was lucky to snag this from the chief engineer because he was always taking them down to get his money out of reclaiming the silver however he could. Moving from there, I went over to a television station, and sensors were not sensors, they were Vidicon tubes. And they were monochrome. So you actually, when you were wanting color out of these, you would have to go over to something. Here's an old film chain from a 1970s television station. And what you have here is actually 3 different cameras, 1, 2, 3, and each one of these would have a monochrome Vidicon tube in it and would be red, green, or blue. The actual path would come in through this beam splitter here to each of the cameras like that. So the Vidicon tubes then got smaller. They became Plumicon tubes, and they looked like this little guy. They were 1/2-inch tubes. So what you ended up with was then the introduction of the, let me get rid of that. There we go. Then you got into the introduction of the small electronic news journalism cameras, the ENG cameras, the Ikigamis, and so forth.
So we can take some dramatic license for our little documentary here, because we're gonna have Tom come in, and Tom's gonna play the fictionalized news coverage who's documenting it in real time. So I guess it'll be, now it's a drama, it's not a documentary anymore. We're gonna make a narrative about the production of Roar through the eyes of Tom as he's capturing it. I like it. Go ahead.
It's already been done. It's on National Geographic's channel called Roar, the Most Dangerous Movie Ever Made, and I appear in it. It's a
Oh, there you go.
Then we get back to our calculators. Well, let's go back before LEDs. You had fluorescent tubes. This is what's called the world's smallest calculator at the time, 1970. Weighed 1.75 pounds, measured 7 inches on one side, 7 by some 4 inches and so forth. It was better than my previous device. I mean, it did have a few more significant digits, so we could do that.
That's great. Wow.
Yeah, this thing actually retailed for $345 at that time. That would be like $2,700 in
awesome.
today's dollars.
Yeah.
And
wow.
yet it was considered the smallest available.
Well, thanks, Tom. That's great. We're gonna keep moving. We've got a couple more we want to share before we get to questions. Chris, why don't you hop in?
Okay.
So I got a handful of stuff. I'll try and focus on the things that are old that I actually use. And so this is the first one right here. You know, this is my Nikon 300 millimeter 2.8 lens, and unfortunately, most of my old stuff is photography related. So you know, it's not video production, but pretty close. But this lens right here is almost 20 years old, and I use it all the time. It's just as good as, not just as good as a new one, but the optics are great. And so it's like old lenses, you know, that's one of the things where they say you invest in your lens, not in your camera. And so that's absolutely been true for me. And so, you know, 20 years old and going strong. The other thing I have is these lights behind me. These are Palsy Bluff White Lightning Studio strobes. This one, I didn't buy it new, so I can't tell you the exact age of it, but it could be as old as 40 years. Somewhere between 35 and 40 years old, this lens, or this light. I have 4 of these models, and I have currently one of these ones, which is a slightly newer model, but it's still, this one's probably 30 years old. And I use these for shoots. And actually, I literally on eBay just bought another one of these 35-plus-year-old studio strobes because I got a shoot coming up where I need 6 strobes and I only had 5. And it was cheaper to buy one old one to fit what I have than to buy all new. So that's kind of, you know, it's old, but it still functions. Everything plugs into this little remote controller via telephone cable. And so there's telephone cords that go from the lights to here, and then I can remote control everything, and then I can plug in a wireless transmitter into here. And so a little mix of the new and the old. And you know, like I said, I still use this. I have a shoot coming up next Wednesday and I'll be lugging out all this gear. And the last one that I really use a lot is these 3-way heads. And this is an old Bogan head, and this thing is built like a tank. And I don't know how old it is, but it's probably got to be at least 30 years old. But I use these all the time. As a matter of fact, we have a local camera store that for several years, every time I went in, it's a great camera store, and they have all kinds of used stuff and whatnot. And every time I went in there, I was like, oh, you've got another 3-way head? I'll take that. I'll take it. Bought every 3-way head they had come in the shop. So just some really old stuff that I still use all the time.
And when you make a relationship with those local resellers, and just go in and don't be a customer all the time. Go in there and just geek out and talk with people that are like-minded about these kind of things. You never know. You might end up with more pieces of vintage gear when they get something that somebody's given up. You know, the theme here seems to be that if it's dealing with physics, right? If it's something with optics, or it's how light's passing through something, or how sound's passing through something, or how I'm going to amplify light, those things can get some serious years out of them. So it's the digital stuff that's 30 or 40 years old is interesting, but it's maybe not what we would use in production today. Meanwhile, you know, if you need to support a camera head, supporting 20, 30 pounds is supporting 20, 30 pounds, no matter what year it is. Go ahead, Jesse.
All right, let's get into a little light ASMR. This is stuff we actually use on pretty much, we'll have one version of these on all of our productions. We just do a lot of our BTS on film, and sometimes we actually shoot film. So first we're busting out the trusty Mamiya. Here we go. Ooh, that's nice. Let's move on down the line. When we're feeling a little more adventurous than just 35 millimeter stills, we will bust out the Canon 1014. And when it's time to punish ourselves, we break out the Krasnogrosk 3, the only camera that was designed from the ground up to hate its user. And I'll give that a good wind.
Kind of like a bell and howl.
Yep, and we're going to put this one up to 48 frames per second. There you go.
Eat your heart out, Phantom.
There we go. Foley. You need it for Foley. You know, that's actually something that I hadn't thought of. When you have that older gear sitting around that makes some sort of noise, you can have authentic, and there's something that maybe people won't know that it's authentic Foley, but somewhere they're going to feel it. It's like you read the story about the persons who their Leica camera is the shutter sound for all the iPhones. And to this day, when they hear somebody take a picture with the iPhone, they kind of look around. The sound matters. Jason, you had a couple things?
Boy, you guys are making me feel like a kid. Okay, here we go. So I still use a Canon 60 Mark II with a 20 or a 70 to 200 2.8. I adore this camera, and there's exactly one reason that I'll have a hard time ever getting rid of it. It has GPS. It is built-in GPS, and it synchronizes no matter what. I used this last time, actually this year at NAB for some office hours coverage, and it worked like a charm. I adore using GPS. This is a pair of Electrovoice RE27s. The 20s I couldn't find because I don't regularly use those. And there was a time back in the day when, this product has been tested and packed to meet all quality requirements by Joy Roscobb. And, there's the technical manager and the customer service manager and the operations manager's names and extensions for that. As far as kind of old meets new, for things that are actually truly still in my rig, this is an iPod that's just plugged in. I've actually rebuilt this, so it takes an SD card, and it allows me to use an SSD into the input. Yeah, that's right. So here it is, and right now this is the mix, and if you look, there's the spectral output. So, I mean, it works. It works beautifully. It actually works better than the day that I got it because I rebuilt the main board, replaced the battery, and now can use SD cards and just swap them out.
Go ahead, Alexander.
I have a bunch of stuff that's in a rack I can't really show, but this one was loose, so I just pulled it out. And I was recently using it until it had some problems and it needs to be serviced again. This is, it's upside down. This is the Symmetrix 528E mic processor. So it has been in use and is still in use today in a lot of radio stations. I actually, in fact, got this from Chorus Entertainment when they were gutting their stations and going completely digital. But it's a fantastic mic processor. You got preamp section, you got your de-esser, compressor, downward expander, full parametric EQ, and even a voice symmetry button at the end. So this is a really great analog processor, which I'm going to serve. It's got some weird crackling issues on the mic preamp end, so I got to probably some caps or maybe some. Anyways, it's got to be cleaned out and serviced, but that's the thing I love about analog gear like that is that it's so simple to service. You can take even a 60-year-old piece of equipment, like even vacuum tube stuff, just recap the board, and then it's as good as new or if not better than it was. So, and that stuff can continue to be used for years and years and years.
Go ahead, Josh.
Well, I can't quite go back to the vintage of my vintage is a little more recent than others, but in a time after cassette decks and before recording onto the computer was the norm, there was an alternative that could have been, but didn't really stay around, and it was the mini disc unit. And you could actually get professional mini disc deck. This is a 1U. It's the MDS E12. It takes stereo, balanced in and out cables, along with the digital coax input, had all of your serial and your backwards compatibility there. There was also a PS2 port that enabled you to plug in a keyboard having trouble with the focus there. Plug in a keyboard to where you can name your tracks, because you could skip back and forth with the mini disc track. And if you were full on into the mini disc lineup, then of course you had to take them from the conventional medium at the time, which required that you be able to convert from the CD to mini disc. So having a deck is super helpful for that too. It had quite an impressive remote control with like 25 different tracks actually. That's how you know you were serious about that. So this was helpful for the capture of devices. And things that are actually still useful today but had some other vintage is there was a time whenever the Talkboy from the Home Alone series had some really good, signal to noise ratio you could get with the recording and playback. And so, there was this guy had quite the run for a while. Worked fantastic, and be able to ward off as a security team as well.
Hey, it's
Josh,
coming
just
back.
to show you, I actually have. So these are some of those.
Disc.
This is David Sanborn, and here's my collection of mini discs. Some of the ones that I recorded, but then here's my mini disc recorder with the optional battery pack. So this is the portable unit with the batteries. Pretty cool for back in the day.
This is proof that both Guy and Josh had more money than me in 1994.
That's right.
Well, I had that one, and it had the inline remote control, which had the LED on it that you could plug your headphones into and then skip tracks. So whenever you're snowboarding, you could actually see the tracks before the MP3 players kicked in. That's the one.
Oh yeah, I had that one too. I had it hardwired into my truck. I had had a device that took my mini disc and plugged it right into the antenna of the receiver, and so I could listen to my mini discs in my truck. It was awesome.
Well, of course, you had to have a place to put your mini discs, and so you need the whoops. It has to be right side up. It only works one direction. Right side up is the way that you want to use it. So having the retractable drawers, to where you could pull the mini discs out at any point.
Somebody
heard it
mark
here
that
from
for
the
end of your
experts.
show highlights.
From experts, open the drawer, right side up.
This
Gravity is not your friend. Yes.
I don't know if it's me or if it's. I do find there's a certain luster to older stuff. I guess that's just called nostalgia. But specifically, like when you look at the evolution of things over time, like while I hadn't unpacked the hi-fi because I was waiting until the new office got built. But then this show kind of hastened that. But as I was unpacking all of the older gear, and you just see like how the evolution of things happened, and you look at the different phones, and you're like, oh man, we had this trio with the keyboard, or the Apple TV used to be humongous, and with component jacks on the back, and you're just like, or composite jacks on the back, and you're like, what is going on? This is amazing. Yeah, it's just this has been fun, but we do have some questions coming in from the producers, so we're going to hop into those. Alexander, let's get to the first one.
First one's from Andy Kokendorfer in Vieira, Florida. Do you still have a place for vintage lighting fixtures like mole, fresnels, etc.?
Go ahead, Bill.
Well, a place for, the big problem is just power. Back in the day, we didn't have all of the high-efficiency LEDs that almost everything is built off of today. So literally probably 50% of the wattage or the power that you threw into a light would just go up in heat. And, particularly in places like Arizona where you have to pay a lot for air conditioning, having Fresnel lenses, those big Fresnel fixtures, a 650-watt Fresnel it's like a space heater. So now these the original LED arrays, those kind of panels with lots of little beads, and then the big transition from there to cob or chip on board LEDs just put out so much more light, and they sip power so delicately compared to those old things that's the big reason that you don't see them on sets very much at all anymore. There are exceptions, and if you're in Hollywood and working, they'll bring out the bigger traditional tungsten-based or HMI-based lighting. But boy, the LEDs are just so much more efficient and so much better for the environment. You're just using a ton less power and still getting the light output you want. And since they went to that single chip on board, it's controllable and you can use barn doors and things like that. During the transition period, that was hard. So there's still a place for them, but only if you want to spend the money and generate the heat.
It's LED, baby. That is a whole different meaning. LED, baby, is a whole different meaning to Courtney Gooden. Courtney, go ahead.
When I started in the industry, I started as a lamp operator on movies. So I was on Outlaw Blues. I was a lamp operator. And this is the lamp that we were using, which was a Mole Richardson Maxi Brute carbon arc light. And it's a Fresnel. You'll notice that there's a chimney on top. That's because these burned carbon rods. And, it was my job to trim the arc, which is where you adjust the carbon rod so that the arc between them is just right, so that arc is burning brightest. And I used to work with a DP that would love the light that these things gave off. They were 225 amps, so you needed a pretty hefty generator, and they're DC 225 amps. At 220 volts. So you needed a big rectifier to rectify that DC, and the rectifier was about 3.5 feet long, and it was made a great heater because it sat usually at the bottom of you can see a picture of one here. This is the rectifier on the bottom. We'd give off a lot of heat on those cold nights. We would all huddle around the rectifiers to stay warm. Those were the days, yeah. And if they used them on stage, the carbon soot would build up that was coming out of that chimney. And after a while, everybody's eyes were tearing up because it got the pollution on the set was so bad you could just barely breathe.
Whoever's doing continuity says, can we dust the set, please? Go ahead, Jason.
For those of you that don't know, to put that in perspective, the average American household has a total draw of between 100 and 200 amps, the vast majority of them. So like 225 is absolutely insane. I'm remembering that when Bohemian Rhapsody came out and all those chrome cans, all the way across the stage came kind of rocketing back in fashion. And a friend of mine who did lighting would buy them and then put LED strip, in front of the stage so that they were really visible. And then would just put, LED strip projection lighting behind it. So the audience couldn't see it. And you could see all these incredible colors coming up. But they weren't on because they're really, really hot.
Better in the north and getting it toasty. But next question.
Douglas Carmichael asked, the RHCP Unlimited Love Tour used a Fairchild 670 tube compressor at front of house. Would you trust taking vintage gear on tour?
Alexander?
Well, if you're going to take it on tour, yes. I mean, I would trust it if it was recently serviced. So, if you're going to use a piece of equipment that is 60 years old, it'd have to be completely serviced top to bottom. And if you can afford it, if you have a second one as a backup, it's always a good idea. It's actually quite common these days. A lot of front of house engineers have hybrid setups where they have a digital console like a Avid or Digico or SSL and a host of outboard analog gear, and sometimes also even plugins using Waves servers. They have usually a redundant server that they can go to if the first one fails. And also, you always want to program a button on your console, which I can't even say because there's an expletive, but we usually call that button a very specific name, and that button will bypass all the outboard gear and your plugin servers. So if something happens, you can just default to the onboard DSP processing that's on your console in case of an emergency. You do always need to account for that.
Courtney?
If you have a lot of tube gear like this compressor, it can be dangerous to use it on a road tour because the tubes can shake loose. Of course, the more tube gear that you have in a single console, the better you are. Because once you get those consoles up to about 500 or 600 pounds, they're not going to be, no stagehand's going to be throwing them on the truck from 3 feet away and hitting the ground where it'll shake the tubes out of the sockets. If they're in a rack and they're going into a semi truck that has air shocks on it. It'll be a pretty smooth ride for that stuff. Every now and then you want to go in and reseat all the tubes because they can get loose and can cause arcing or can cause corrosion on the contacts. But a lot of people prefer that old tube sound, and to maintain that stuff, you got to just be careful about. I wouldn't put those tube compressors in a small case that can be thrown or fall off the top of another case and hit the ground, because that's a recipe for disaster.
Alexander?
Yeah, so a couple things too. When you're going to take this kind of gear, you would never put that stuff into production without having parts available and the tools to repair that stuff. So, on these types of tours, you've got people that know how to repair this gear. They've got soldering irons. They've got replacement parts for this stuff. Replacement, that includes tubes, caps, resistors, anything. They've got those stuff. Everything is in a parts bin. Everything's perfectly labeled. So if there's an emergency, they can do repairs on that stuff. Of course, all that stuff is thoroughly tested before tours. And of course, once they start getting all the gear set up, that stuff is thoroughly tested as well to make sure that it still works properly.
On the greatest hits list of office hours aphorisms, if you can say that 10 times fast, the highest cost of any production is failure. So if you have a constraint or a single point of failure anywhere in your production chain, be that a tube compressor or something else, what's your backup plan? The trust is all about how you're preparing for it. Next question.
Andy Kokendorfer in Vieira, Florida is asking, what is your favorite vintage mic for Zoom?
Go ahead, Alexander.
Well, if I own one, it would definitely be an RCA 44, but that's way out of my budget to buy a vintage one. So I'll probably settle for an AEA R44 mic. They are by far the most faithful recreation of that microphone. In fact, they bought up a lot of the original RCA components, and they still actually use them and work them into the recreations of those microphones. They've got various flavors of that microphone, including a museum grade R44, which is by far the most expensive one that they make. So, and it's still on my list. I do plan on getting one eventually, and that's the mic that I would probably use.
Go ahead, Tom.
Well, I still have my original Electro Voice 635A. Now, this is probably the best mic drop mic you can get, because they used to come in and bring a 10-penny nail and a 2x4 to demonstrate it to us, and they would hammer that nail into the 2x4 and hand us the mic and say, plug it in. It still works.
Courtney?
Well, I still have, although it's in the closet, I couldn't get to it, is a couple of these Sheps MK41s with a CMC 600 preamps on them, and it's a beautiful sounding microphone. Now for comms, we use these new, I use a tablet PC, but in the old days, we used to use this. This is a Lafayette CB radio that we used to use for comms on the set. Remember Lafayette? Took 12 pin-like batteries to keep it powered.
And remember, when you're getting these into Zoom, because you're plugging in the vintage microphone, original sound on. Important if you're really trying to get those vintage characteristics. Go ahead, Jason.
I actually do use these for Zoom, for on-site work, because I've spent enough time in an FM studio. These are the most. This is an EV RE27, and what's nice about them is that they look really giant, and people don't tend to mess around with them. But even if they do, the off-axis rejection, this is basically a humbucking microphone, which is what this stuff in the side is designed to do. But just right in line, you've got these great roll-off switches. This can be put in a kick drum in a heavy metal band, and it will not bottom out. The off-axis rejection is excellent, and the total sound pressure that it can handle is pretty spectacular.
Go ahead, Alexander.
Yeah, I own multiple RE27s. Those are fantastic. Quick, Jason, swap your mic right now.
I'm not going to gain stage like that. Come on. Bad form, Alexander.
Next question.
Next question comes from the QR code Gabriela Cheso Mistiera and Suse Marie. Happy 808 Day. In celebration of all the 808s and heartbreaks, what's your favorite use of the classic 808? How would you want to use it today?
Alexander?
I'm not I love the sounds of synths, but I don't own any. I'm not really a synth guy, but I love the 808. So I think we're talking about this one here, the Roland 808, which of course was introduced at the beginning of the 1980s, which as far as I understand, the reason why people jumped on that thing is because you could actually program your own drum sounds as opposed to just using pre-made patches, which was a big deal. So this was up there with the more expensive Linn drum machine, which was also another popular drum machine. But I listened to a lot of music in the synth wave genre, and that type of drum sound, programmed drum sound, is very, very ubiquitous in that style of sort of retro 80s synth pop music. So it's a good choice.
Jesse?
What can I say about the 808? It's amazing, so amazing, so amazing. It's amazing. I love that unit, and what I love, I don't know that there's any new application of the classic format strictly as a drum machine that we could do. But what I love about it is that it has entered into the hip hop lexicon as just a casual item to reference, like Grey Poupon. I think, because 808 has a really nice syllable set, it lends itself well to interesting rhymes, just like Grey Poupon does, and it shows up all the time in hip-hop. In the lyrics, I mean, not in the music. In the actual lyrics, shout out to Watsky, an 808 kick is his Gatorade drink.
I need somebody to remix whatever the beginning and the end of Jesse's answer there, because there was a great, the meter was wonderful, and I think it's primed for a remix. Go ahead, Jason.
Africa Bambaata's Planet Rock, probably the most memorable 808 that comes to mind. It's really old. It was released in 1982. And how would I use it today? I wouldn't. I'd use an iPad.
There you go. Next question.
Paul Wallace in Austin, Texas asks, can you hook up old computers like an Apple IIe, 2C, and I'm not sure what that symbol is supposed to mean, etc., to the internet?
Go ahead, Tom.
Well, that symbol's for the Apple II, and I let my AOL account go a while back, and also threw out the US Robotics 2400 baud modem. You know, those Napster downloads, they just took forever.
Jason?
Yeah, you absolutely could. Common misconception. The internet is not the World Wide Web. It's far older than that. And you can absolutely use older protocols if you so chose. And you'd probably be less susceptible to modern infection than your average Windows 11 machine. Sorry.
Bill?
Well, I just remember my first modem was 300 baud. And everybody who's really old and was around in those days remembers that sound of it trying to negotiate and connect. It is a very specific sound. You can find it on the web. And we heard that hundreds of times. I remember I felt so much relief when I moved to 1200 baud and then, like Tom mentioned, 2400. You just felt like suddenly the world was opening up to you. With today's speed, that's going to be that and finding DB25s and the other kind of classic connectors that used to connect our gear, something that will take that protocol and read it into something new is a little bit iffy. Can you do it? Yes. You just have to go down that path and find the vintage computer clubs and make sure that you have the right translators, software, and mechanical connections where you can make it work.
Courtney?
Yeah, you can. I was the technical consultant on Young Sheldon when they did this episode called The Cooper Family Gets a Computer. And there's Young Sheldon with his Tandy 1000. I had to create all the screens and all the programs that he used on that show. So, yeah, we had to simulate logging in. There's an episode where he logs in over a modem to hack another computer and had to generate all the code that looks accurate and sounds accurate to dialing up and using that Tandy 1000 on the, quote, internet, which was just a BBS at that time.
Chris?
In another community I'm involved in, we were just yesterday, we're talking about back in the day using Norton Ghost to image a computer. And it came up that when I was doing this back in the day, this is what we use. This Zircom parallel port to RJ45 TCP/IP network adapter. And I mean, the Apple IIes, they've got parallel ports. You just need one of these devices and you're good to go, right? Isn't that how it works?
Jesse?
But the good news is you can access alt.fan.oingo boingo from a modern computer as well.
Next question.
Douglas Carmichael asks, as the analog console fleet ages and the part supplies dry up, do you think we'll see those engineers that still take them on tour reluctantly switch to a modern digital console?
Bill?
I think analog consoles, just because there's so many great mixers who really understand them, will take longer than a lot of things. But I'm also reminded, I had a friend back when I lived in Arizona who lived in my neighborhood, and he was a touring keyboard technician with very, 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 very big acts. And it was really fascinating. One of the first things he told me is, every time you see something like a Steinway Mini Grand on stage at something, just know that I or somebody like me has gone in, gutted the thing, pulled it out, and installed an actual digital electronic keyboard with weighted keys and everything. There is no way in the world you're going to take an actual piano with a harp and strings on tour and toss them into trucks and move them across the country and have them stay in tune. So at some point, the practicalities of the utility you get out of a modern device just simply outweigh the loveliness of having a vintage acoustic or old analog era piece of gear. You know, you got to keep the show up and you got to keep performing. And sometimes that's why you lose some of this cherished old analog stuff.
Alexander?
Modern digital consoles are very difficult to repair because they have a lot of different circuit boards and surface mount technology built by robots. One of the nice things about high-end analog consoles, they were designed to be modular. And so I was just watching an interview with Dave Natal, the front-of-house engineer for the Rolling Stones, who travels with an analog console, all outboard gear. You know, he has a lot of replacement parts. And if a channel strip dies, the beautiful thing about that is that you can just pull the channel out and you can replace it. And he has a lot of backup components on tour with him. So I don't think that's a problem. There are always parts available. And, you know, if you're someone like him, you probably buy up a lot of those parts and stock them and keep them well in service. Yeah. And I mean, if you look at touring acts that use vintage gear, it's not like it's just small time. I mean, if sometimes that's just what the shows were built on and what that's the tool the artist is comfortable using. Now, there are definite advantages to getting new stuff, but if the artist can't produce their work, like if you look at Billy Joel's lighting designer, Steve Cohen, famously still to this day runs his shows off of a Martin Maxi M1 console. It's like the console feels ancient to anybody else, but to him, that's what he uses. Next question. Paul Wallace in Austin, Texas asks, I have dozens of the original IBM PS2 solid click keyboards stashed in one of my cargo containers. They're so rugged. Is there a way to adapt these to work as USB keyboards?
Jason?
Yeah, absolutely. There are two different sizes to PS2. There is the original giant PS2, and the pinout is the same for the more common, slightly smaller PS2. And yeah, absolutely. This is actually a very easy conversion, and I do have somewhere one of those IBM keyboards, and I remember distinctly that I could put it in the dishwasher to clean it.
Courtney?
Yeah, as Jason said, there are adapters PS2 to USB. And I had a bunch of these keyboards too with the cherry switches, the clicky switches. But, you know, I was very disappointed. I brought one out recently and hooked it up, and half of the keys don't make contact anymore because they had silver contacts on them, which became tarnished over the years. And since they've been sitting, unless they've been sitting in climate controlled, super dry environment, you know, you can't go in and clean the contacts inside each key, which would be a major undertaking these days to get them to all work again. So I was kind of disappointed that it didn't.
Next question.
Graham Cardwell in Belfast, Northern Ireland is asking, I used notes on my original iPad mini running iOS 9 to hold my father of the bride speech this week. I've never thought I'd use that device again, but it did a great job. Are there any useful sources for software devices of that vintage?
Jason?
That particular vintage is kind of difficult because you are just old enough to not be able to get into the modern app store, but certainly new enough that Apple will still police the intellectual property involved with that iPad. long story short, if you keep holding on to it and the battery doesn't explode, then archive.org may very well end up being an archival site. But I've found on an extremely old, up to and including the original iPad, you can still connect to Wi-Fi, assuming that the Wi-Fi version you have will go back that far. Your transmitter will work, and still access all of the apps. It's worth saying, though, that just about every app for IS9 that will ever be built has been built and is probably still available on the App Store.
Next question.
Simon Ray and Midlands UK is asking, Courtney, would you mind lifting the lid of that little printer for the TRS-80? I believe it has 4 tiny ballpoint pens inside. It was a 4-color plotter back in the very early 80s.
Oh, I'm not sure, Courtney. Do you have that one? Is it still handy?
I have it, but it is not the one you're thinking of. This is actually a thermal printer because it's an alphanumeric printer. It has just a little roll of thermal paper, and it had a dot matrix thermal print head that would use. The one you're thinking about was the color printer, which did have little tiny color pins in it, and it would go pick up a different color, and that would draw the image. It was a vector-based printer. But this is a dot matrix thermal printer, because the other one, the one with the pins in it, was about 4 times the size of this one, and didn't run on batteries.
Yeah, even recently, I think I was renting a car, and the car rental place, because they were using carbon paper, was still using the dot matrix printer. There's still a market. They're still out there. I love the sound. We need some Foley out of that out of that computer, Courtney. Next question.
Eric Price in Kansas City is asking, are others out there still using their Sound Devices Pix 220i or 240i? I still use mine as a safety recording on program out from my ATEM Mini. It's been a workhorse.
Courtney?
There are a couple of good uses for it. Mine's still in a Gator rack case it's still as a portable input, output, and recorder in there. Getting the hard drives for them to work is, they're just SSD drives, but to plug into the caddies, you had to put them in a caddy to put them in, which was kind of a pain. But one thing they were good for is an analog to HDMI inputs, because they had XLR inputs and pretty good audio preamps because they came from Sound Devices. So as to get analog into an HDMI signal, it's great because it has SDI to HDMI conversion as well. So you could use it for an SDI to HDMI converter, and you can use it besides as a recorder, and you can use it as an analog interface to HDMI. So it comes in really handy for both of those things. And it still takes batteries, and mine still boots up and runs.
Next question.
Douglas Carmichael asks, interestingly, there's a small community that restores and operates vintage SGI workstations. Are there things SGIs did in their day that modern systems don't do as well?
I got to say, I'm not familiar with this one, but I know Courtney is. So, Courtney, why don't you give us a shot?
My answer is no. The SGI Onyxes, they're pretty much all obsolete. They, the typical, NVIDIA board, 3070 or 3050 can run rings around that SGI workstations. We used them on a number of computers as for special effects or for video playback sometimes, which really they weren't designed for, but we used them during the day. We used them on multiplicity, where we had to synchronize 4 or 5 different video playbacks to a live camera in sync with the motion control. And so we had to build interfaces for it because it didn't do that. And they used to use the Onyxes used to be used in doing live matting, chroma keying on the set for virtual sets. They used to use it for virtual sets in the television industry. We used to use the big SGI Onyxes. But like I say, nowadays we can do that on an ATEM Mini for $300. So no point in reviving those old SGIs. Custom operating system too.
Next question.
Russell K. in Brooklyn, Maine is asking, anyone using their older lenses for film cameras adapted for their mirrorless camera? I have all my old lenses for Leica M3/Pentax 67/Hasselblad 500 CM, for example.
Jesse?
Absolutely, and we actually use these in production, but the use case is very specific. So we keep a small army of, not M42, what are these? M42 lenses, not Micro Four Thirds, M42 lenses. So we got a whole bunch of these with the screw mount, and what we do is we pair them with the Blackmagic, the actual Blackmagic Pocket, and that line of the Micro Studio cameras, because those vintage lenses paired with this camera creates a really good look for concert photography or a concert videography. If we're doing multicam shoot of like a grunge band or a punk band, we want it to kind of feel older and dirtier and nastier. And the M42 lenses on the original Pocket generation really, really delivers that look without the giant spend of shooting on 8 or 16 millimeter. We often do also shoot at the same time on 8 millimeter so that we can intercut, some actual film dirt in there with the relatively clean digital grime.
Chris?
Not specifically, but as I said before when I showed off my 20-year-old lens, that lenses, if the optics are good, they last forever. And one thing that I do is I have a handful of these ATA POV cameras or NDI cameras. They're fancy, they're new, they come with a C-mount lens, and I was thinking one day, I was like, you know what, I think I have a longer C-mount lens. And I pulled out this old Computar lens. It's probably 25 or 30 years old, and it screws right in. And now I've taken a POV camera, and that 75 millimeter lens allows me to set up as an outfield center field camera in baseball. So in the outfield all the way to home plate with a cheap old lens that I just had lying around. So old glass never dies.
Josh?
Well, not lenses, but you might think that the Sony Mavica is out of date. It's not really. I'm a big Sony fanboy, but the 1.4 for floppy disks, you can get an active adapter that has the LiPo batteries. Get your SD card in there, pull it off. You can still use it.
Next question.
From Paul Walhus in Austin, Texas. Why is it when I go to eBay to the vintage computers equipment section that it's nearly all DEC stuff?
Go ahead, Jason.
The Digital Equipment Corporation famously creating the PDP-8. The answer is because vintage is a nebulous weasel word. It doesn't mean anything in actual use. So vintage to Apple is sold, 2017 or later. Vintage to somebody else may very well mean bell-bottom jeans. So you're going to have to be more specific if you're looking for, computers over 20 years old. You're going to have to find a clever way to search for it such that it doesn't get weird. And the category itself, I'm guessing most people that want to sell modern but actually old computer equipment aren't going to call it vintage because they just don't want it on a set somewhere. They think it actually has more value as a use thing instead of as just a plot piece.
Courtney?
Well, the reason you see a lot of them is because the DEC equipment was one of the first mini computers that was available for, you could buy for corporate use. The PDP-11, you see a lot of people restoring these, and they're fun to restore because they've got colorful switches and a lot of flashy LEDs on the front. So they're fun to use in the background, and a lot of people take great joy in restoring them and getting them all working again with all their peripherals that would hook up to them, like the printers and the disk drives, so on. So that came out much later, but the PDP-11 is a very popular one. In fact, they've emulated. You can now get a Raspberry Pi that'll emulate a PDP-11 very easily.
All right. Well, there we go. There you have it. We've got such a great panel to come in today and share all their knowledge with us, not only about how we're using equipment still today, and sometimes it might be a set piece or a way to get Foley, but other times it's still in the pipeline. So it's really great to see how everyone's using it. It's also good perspective for how far we've come, and to see the progression. And sometimes what seems like ancient history really is only the recent past. So it's we need to have an appreciation for how far we've come. Thank yous, though. Thank you to that panel for coming in and giving their expertise and sharing some of their individual walls of depreciation, as we as Alex will say sometimes. It was awesome that we spent the extra time to get that work together. Also, thank you to the back end crew, not only for those folks who are getting up early, staying up late 7 days a week to make this show happen. It would quite literally be impossible without them, but also the folks that are working asynchronously from the show. Folks that are working on the development software, folks that are on the back end and the councils planning the shows. It's not possible without all of those volunteers. And thank you to our producers who were asking questions. Without you, it's a very short show. And today we had a ton of questions. And this show runs on your questions, not only on your questions, though, but also on your generosity. So if you're getting value out of office hours and you like us, consider giving us a little bit of that value back at officehours.global/donate. The Tualack Traversal today, 61,000 miles. That's 98,000 kilometers, 481 million bananas for scale. We'll see you in after hours.
By the way, I did actually plug it in. Check that out. Yep, still sounds fantastic.
Diaphragm still works. So.
Yeah, there we go.
Oh, look at the
Love
PCMCIA slot.
Oh, PCMCIA, the world's hardest acronym to remember, and then you never forget it.
Wireless card, 11 megabit wireless card. You know how much this thing cost back in the day? This was
Mine was from Linksys. Which one was that?
$300.
This was HP.
Ooh, that was very expensive.
The Jornadas
nice.
and the Dell Axons.
Yeah. Just CF, no PCMCIA.
Okay, so
why do I get
game
to
going
the
from
show
1990s?
10 times and not run out of stuff to talk about?
That was really great. Thanks, everyone.
Because we're
Seriously,
all vintage.
That was so fun.
Vintage people here. Yes.
Of a certain vintage.
Fine wine.
See ya.
That's right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. This makes me think of when they redubbed Super Mario 64.